The chandelier crashed mid-song, scattering glass like rain across the polished floor. Grace froze, her microphone still in hand, as Daniel's calm voice echoed through the speakers. "Tell him the truth, Grace, or I will." Every face in the room turned toward her, eyes wide, waiting for blood or confession. Her pulse drummed louder than the alarms. Some secrets, she realized, don't stay buried. They claw their way to the surface. What happened next shocked everyone and set off a chain of events no one saw coming. Stay with me. This is a story you need to hear. Before we start the story, comment below and let us know where in the world you're watching from today. And if you find this story impactful, don't forget to subscribe for more. Rain had been washing the city all night, as if the sky wanted to scrub every bright thing clean and leave only the hard, wet truth. Streetlights turned the slick pavement into rivers of gold. The smell of wet asphalt rose up with each passing car, and the cafe on the corner steamed like a small, stubborn refuge. Inside, the radio hummed low, and a tired barista moved with careful, quiet motions, each cup measured, each gesture small and precise. Grace sat by the fogged window, her hands cupped around a mug that was too hot for comfort. Steam fogged her glasses, and she wiped a pearl of water from her cheek with the back of her hand without thinking. She kept her coat buttoned to her chin, not from cold but from habit, like armor she had worn for a long time. Her hair was tied back, with a ribbon that had once been white. Now it held the soft gray of too many washes and too many compromises. Outside, people rushed by with umbrellas they used like shields. Inside, the cafe allowed time to be slow and honest. Grace studied the people on their way past the window. She watched for the way some faces never lifted away from their phones, the way others paused just long enough to look at the river of light and wonder if there was a life waiting somewhere else. She liked to memorize small things, the curve of a stranger's jaw, the way a child's laughter bounced off the storefronts. It made her feel less alone, collecting other lives like shells along the shore of her own. She was 24, and she carried the tired weight of someone who had learned how to bend without breaking. She had moved to the city with a borrowed suitcase and a head full of hopes that sometimes looked like fragile paper cranes. She worked 2 jobs, one delivering parcels in the early morning cold, the other at the cafe in the afternoons and nights, because talent did not pay the rent and dreams did not fill the cupboards. Her hands were not delicate anymore. They had the soft calluses of someone who worked with things that mattered and things that did not. On the table beside her, a small, white envelope lay like a promise. She had found it 2 days earlier, pinned under the loose corner of a bulletin board at the community center where she taught dance to children on Saturdays. The envelope had no brand, only a single line of handwriting across the front, for Grace. Inside was a single ticket and an address, an elegant brass-lettered invitation to a charity gala at a riverside manor. The writing had an air of care. It smelled faintly of old paper and something floral. And for a moment Grace had let herself imagine silk dresses and polished shoes, laughter like glass bells. Then she reminded herself she had no silk dress, no polished shoes, and no place in those big rooms where fortunes were warmed like winter bread. She turned the ticket over and found a small notation. "If you can dance this waltz, I'll adopt you." She had laughed then, an uncertain, shocked sound that nearly choked on its own surprise. "Adopt you." The words had the glossy cruelty of a joke meant to be tasted and discarded, but the phrase lodged itself in her ribs like a splinter. Adopt, as if her life could be traded like a possession, as if a signature could change the weather within her. Grace had not told anyone about the envelope. She did not tell Mara, who swept the cafe nightly and offered advice as if the world could be repaired with strong coffee and sterner words. She did not tell Pastor Joel, who always touched her shoulder when the sermon ended and said gently, "You will find your place." She kept it folded in her pocket like something fragile and forbidden. The city had a rhythm of its own, and Grace moved in the quieter bars of that rhythm. She taught children to find joy in steps and held their small hands when the music frightened them. She watched them learn how their feet could speak when their voices were too shy to try. Dance for her was less spectacle and more language. A way to tell the truth without words, a way to let the body confess what the mouth tried hard to hide. It was where she felt most like herself. Tonight, the cafe hummed with low conversation. A man in a dark coat sat at a nearby table, hands folded like a book closed in reverence. He seemed out of place in a place that survived on warm bread and small fortunes. When he looked up, his eyes met Grace's and held for a brief breath of reckoning. He had the flat polish of someone who made choices and watched them stick. There was a quiet about him that suggested power, but it was the kind of power that wore a smile like an armor. His name, she would later learn, was Daniel Harcourt. For now, he was only a face that did not belong to the street, a curiosity she examined without permission. He ordered coffee in a voice that did not need to be loud. The barista slid the cup across with practiced ease. Daniel's fingers brushed the cup's rim and left an almost imperceptible trace of cologne, a cool and sharp scent like newly printed money. Grace felt the heat of scrutiny without the comfort of knowing why she burned. She folded the ticket back into the envelope and smoothed it with a careful thumb. Something in her tightened. She had learned to expect tests of patience, late bills, broken heaters, neighbors who felt entitled to small cruelties, but she had not learned how to answer the kind of challenge that came wrapped in silk and smirk. She remembered the first time she had danced for an audience. It had been in a gym with peeling paint and a single string of lights that thundered like distant applause. Her knees had been raw with nerves, and her mother had whispered, "Hold the music in your ribs." She had done it then, not for money or for praise, but because the motion made her whole. That feeling was a fragile country she guarded fiercely. Across the room, the man in the dark coat rose and walked toward the door. He glanced back as if deciding whether to stay. His gaze skimmed her again, and Grace understood, in the small, precise way a sparrow senses a shadow, that her life was about to flicker against someone else's intentions. She did not know if it would be flame or ash. Outside, the rain softened into a polite drizzle. The city lights blurred into watercolor. Grace tucked the envelope deeper into her pocket and told herself, like a prayer, that she would not be tempted by promises that sounded like bargains. Yet, the ticket pressed warm against her thigh, as if it had its own pulse. She imagined the music in the manor. A piano lifting notes like small, polite birds, a band of strangers swirling in uniforms of silk, a room full of people who believed nothing and expected everything. She rose to clear a table and found her hand steady enough. She moved among the cups and saucers with the quiet authority of someone who belonged to ordinary labor. But when she caught sight of her reflection in the coffee machine, a young woman with tired eyes and a stubborn set to her mouth, Grace felt both a fierce tenderness and a searing hunger. Maybe, she thought, the waltz was less about who would adopt whom and more about who would finally see her. Maybe it was less the offer and more the idea of standing under a light and being named. A bell over the cafe door chimed, and a gust of rain announced a new arrival. Grace looked up and met the gaze of a small boy with a chocolate-smeared face and enormous, honest eyes. He grinned like the whole world was a joke he had not yet learned to guard. She laughed, too, a sound that slid free of her chest like a small bird finding open air, and felt the room tilt toward a possibility that smelled faintly of hope and ozone. The envelope in her pocket throbbed like a question. Outside, the river ran on, careless and sure. Inside, Grace carried her quiet, the weight of steps she had learned to take alone. The night had only just begun. The morning the world tightened around Grace like a fist. The rain had stopped but left every surface sharp and bright. Her shoes clicked on the community center floor as she swept the last crumbs from the studio, the children's small jackets still hanging on the hooks like sleepy flags. She hummed an old hymn under her breath, something steady to hold the weight of the day, and tried to fold the memory of the envelope into the ordinary rhythm of sweeping dust and straightening chairs. The phone on the counter buzzed. The number was unknown. She wiped her hands and answered with the soft politeness her mother had taught her. "Hello." A voice came that sounded too smooth for the small room. "Miss Grace, This is Mr. Daniel Harcourt. I trust you found my invitation." For a moment, she thought of the envelope, the ticket, the laughing, cruel line written on it. She kept her face neutral. "Yes, I found it. I will arrange transport for you tonight. There are people you should meet. Come early." Before she could answer, the line clicked. A small, precise unease settled in her chest, the same way a stone settles under your shoe and only becomes noticed when you shift weight. She folded the broom handle against the wall and walked to the window. Outside, a delivery truck hissed steam into the air. Inside, the studio smelled like rosin and polish and the faint sweetness of the children's hair. She told herself to breathe. She told herself the envelope was probably a mistake, a prank, or some eccentric charity nonsense. Yet, the name Daniel Harcourt tasted like metal on her tongue. That afternoon, Mara leaned against the doorframe like she had a right to place. "You look like you swallowed a secret," she said, half a smile, half warning. Grace turned the broom and set it down. "A man called. I want to go to some gala." Mara's eyebrows rose. "Daniel Harcourt. That name follows money like a shadow. He donates when the cameras are there, not when roofs leak." Grace felt the heat of something like shame. He wrote, "If you can dance this waltz, I'll adopt you." Mara flinched and then laughed, a brittle sound. "Adopt you? Like you're a lost painting at an auction. Don't let a rich man trade you for his amusement." But Grace heard something else in Mara's eyes. A sharp, worried hope that she tried to hide from herself. The word adopt had lodged deeper than either of them had admitted. It suggested rescue, though rescue had never been a promise she believed could be mailed. That evening, she found herself standing on a curb in a dress she had borrowed from Pastor Joel's sister, cheap lace stretched over hesitant seams. The car that rolled up smelled faintly of cedar. A man in a black coat stepped out and smiled the way someone smiles when opening a present they have already chosen to keep. He tilted his head, and for a second, his expression softened into something almost kind. "Grace," he said, "so glad you came." She noticed his hands. They were careful hands, practiced at containing small things. On his wrist was a watch the color of winter steel. On his finger, a ring that caught the street light like a promise. He did not look like someone who played with the poor for sport. He looked like someone who had made sport of everything and learned to wear civility as armor. At the manor, chandeliers dripped light like waterfalls. Guests moved with the practiced ease of people who knew the rules. Laugh at the right moments, sip wine at the right speed, admire without envy. Grace felt like a punctuation mark misplaced in a sentence. She clutched the small purse and felt Pastor Joel's quiet blessing in her mind. She told herself she could leave. She felt the ticket in her pocket as if it had a pulse. They led her to a terrace where the waltz would start. A string quartet tuned like distant weather. Daniel stood at the edge of the terrace, smiling at people who smiled back with leisured attention. He raised a glass to some name she didn't know. A perfume of success and old money drifted over his shoulder. When he turned, his gaze found Grace and held a fraction too long. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said when the quartet began, "tonight we celebrate second chances, but a true second chance should prove its worth. Ms. Grace has accepted a small test. If she can dance the classical Harcourt waltz without missing a measure, I will offer her," he let the word hang like a coin, "a home. An adoption in all legal terms." A murmur ran through the gathered guests. Some smiled as if at a charity anecdote. Some smirked like scavengers smelling opportunity. Grace felt every eye. The terrace became a stage that showed how small she was when placed between chandeliers and the judgeful pleasure of a wealthy crowd. She stepped forward because no other motion came. The music rose and cinched at her ribs. She wanted to move with the children's pure joy, without intention, without proof. But the notes demanded something else. Precision, a language she had learned to speak in classrooms and gymnasiums, not to be judged by committees who counted breath and measured grit with silver spoons. She danced. Her feet remembered numbers and the place of the music inside her. For a few measures, she was the old, whole country she had been, the place that felt like belonging. Then a woman at the edge of the crowd laughed, soft but sharp, and the sound spread like a pebble across water. Someone clapped in a way that read as mockery. Daniel watched her with an unreadable face, the light catching the hollows beside his mouth, where humor sometimes hid knives. When the final notes fell, there was a polite applause. Daniel stepped toward her and reached out, not to steady her, but to take the ticket from her hand. "Very good," he said. "You have grace, Miss Grace." But grace without a pedigree is still only a talent. People like pedigree. The word hit like a winter wind. In the hush that followed, a man near the back, coated in the kind of linen that knows no rain, asked loudly, "Is she really eligible? How do we know there aren't others who need help more?" A ripple of laughter. The laughter was a blade. Grace felt the floor tilt. Her face flushed and cooled on reflex, and she realized the crowd had been invited to play judge. The ticket in Daniel's fingers was warm. He smiled, and the smile did not reach his eyes. As the guests drifted away, Dean, one of the event coordinators, stood in the doorway clutching a small photograph. He handed it to Daniel with a murmured apology. Daniel glanced at the small square and then at the map of faces dispersing over the lawn. The photograph showed a young woman with Grace's eyes, but younger and smiling in a photograph that had been taken decades ago. Daniel's brow shifted, a small shadow that barely registered. From where Grace stood, she could not tell if the photograph mattered or if it was merely proof Daniel would use to confirm a private account. But the photograph left a cold line of curiosity in her mind. How did he know something about her past? Why would a man make a public game of a life like a parlor trick? On the walk home, the borrowed dress felt like a costume in a play she had not auditioned for. The city felt both larger and more dangerous than before. Pastor Joel had offered a blessing that morning. Mara had warned her. The envelope had promised a bargain she did not want to own. Daniel's words about pedigree and proofs stirred something older in her. A fear that the world saw her as a problem to be sorted, a commodity to move from one shelf to another. She lay awake that night, listening to the hum of distant traffic and to the small, brave heartbeat of the city. The photograph, the laugh, Daniel's careful hands, pieces of a shape she could not yet name, tumbled in her head like coins in a clothes jar. She had been offered something that looked like salvation and was asked in return to dance under a light that would show every flaw. Some bargains are tempted by need. Some are dressed in silk. Grace knew she had decisions to make. She also knew this. Whoever had sent the ticket had not done so out of charity alone. There was design in the gesture, and design often hides appetite. The bright, polished world of the manor had given her a glimpse of a life that might be possible and then sharpened the edges with the very same hand that had offered it. That night, the city outside her window breathed on, unaware, while inside she felt the first small crack of a story that would not let her go. Grace found the days after the gala strangely loud. The city seemed to replay the terrace lights behind her eyelids when she blinked. People asked how the event had gone as if it were a public exam. Mara asked with the blunt curiosity of sisterhood. Pastor Joel, with the measured tone of pastoral care. Dean, who sometimes stopped by the community center with notices and small favors, pressed his hands into his pockets and spoke as if he feared damaging something delicate. Daniel said to tell you he was impressed. Dean said one morning, avoiding her eyes. He asked me to say he hopes you'll consider more opportunities. Grace folded her hands around a mug and watched steam curl into the air. Opportunities, she repeated, tasting the word like a coin she couldn't spend. What opportunities? Dean hesitated, then shrugged. A placement, a scholarship, a chance to teach in better halls. He offered to connect you with people. Mara snorted. Connect you with people. Translation, he wants you to be a pet at his parties. Her voice carried both warning and a strange, brittle envy. She had always been blunt with Grace, as if bluntness could carve truth free of its hard shell. Grace did not answer. Inside, a small war was starting to set up its lines. The photograph from the gala had pressed under her skin like a foreign seed. She took it out one night and held it to the lamplight. The woman in the picture had Grace's eyes, same slope, same stubborn glint, but the mouth was gentler, softer with laughter. Grace's throat tightened. Her mother had left when she was small. Stories around that absence had been hushed, turned away from like a sore. No one wanted to pick at old wounds. Yet this photograph felt like a hand reaching back through the dark. "Where did he get that picture?" she asked Pastor Joel after evening prayers. Joel folded his hands and glanced away. Daniel collects things. He attends charity records, parish lists. He is thorough. "Did he say anything about my family?" she pressed. Her voice was small, as if she were asking for a piece of bread. He swallowed. He mentioned a woman who used to work at a nursery by the river. He said she had a good laugh. There was a pause. Joel stopped, his fingers flexing against each other as if wringing meaning out of them. "Grace, sometimes people hold onto the past in strange ways." Grace felt the room tilt. "You knew him?" "I knew of him," Joel corrected softly. "When I was young, I worked briefly at the manor during a summer program. Daniel was a donor then. He was different, less guarded, but I was young." He gave her a look that was meant to be protective and failed in the way all protective looks sometimes do. It hid more than it showed. That night, Grace dreamed of the manor. Chandeliers like frozen waterfalls, a woman smiling whose eyes were paper-thin with secrets, and Daniel watching from a doorway, as if the scene were a set, and he had the right to move the props. She woke with her heart beating like a drum in her chest, questions crowding the narrow hallways of her mind. She began to watch Daniel in the small ways she could. Through Dean when he returned messages, through Pastor Joel's hesitant admissions, through the gossip that wafted like steam through the city's alleys. Daniel sent letters to the community center asking about program funding. He attended other events, always polite, always bright with the kind of attention that made people reveal seams they kept hidden. Mara noticed the change. "You're getting quiet about him," she said, pressing an extra tortilla into Grace's hand like a bribe. "You used to laugh him off." Grace swallowed. "He knows something." Mara's face went still. "What do you want to do? Walk away? Or find out?" The question hung in the air between them. Finding out felt dangerous in the way curiosity always does when it leans close to a sleeping animal. But walking away felt like folding a map with a pin in the place where you might have been saved. Grace asked Daniel for a meeting under the pretense of thanking him for the invitation. He agreed with a speed that suggested he had been waiting for justification. They met in a small room at the back of the manor where shadows pooled like secrets. Daniel's smile was a practice thing. It settled into place like a mask. He poured tea with the precise movements of a man who had learned to smooth the edges of his presence. "You dance well," he said. "More than that, you moved with a truth that we often pay to see and never find." "Why me?" Grace asked. Her voice was steady, though the tremor in her stomach was like a bird on a wire. "Why send that ticket in a plain envelope? Why the phrase, 'If you can dance this waltz, I'll adopt you,' as if life were a raffle?" Daniel folded his hands on the table. "Because I believe in gestures," he said. "Because sometimes, Grace, the best way to reach someone is with something that leaves them no room to refuse. And because I know a truth about you that others might not." He paused, and the silence after the pause felt like a closed fist. "What truth?" she asked. He looked at her as if measuring the exact temperature of a response. "That someone you loved once knew these rooms. That you are not entirely a stranger to us." The world narrowed. Grace felt the room press in on her like a chorus. "My mother?" The word came out like a radio station found on a stormy night. Daniel's mouth softened. Her name was Eleanor. She taught children to sing by the river. She died before I could make amends. Grace's knees trembled. There was a fierce animal noise inside her chest that wanted to wreck the room. "My mother disappeared. She didn't die in town. She left." The words were scraped raw by memory. "No one knows where she went." Daniel's eyes held her. "I knew Eleanor," he said quietly. "I thought of helping her once. I thought," he swallowed as if a bitter draft had passed his lips. "I believed I could offer her something. But there are times when chances get mislabeled as kindness. A coldness settled in Grace like winter under the skin. "So, you watched?" "I watched and I hesitated," he admitted, "and I am not asking forgiveness. I'm offering an opportunity. If you're willing to let me help, I will." His words were a net thrown over a river. They promised rescue and demanded trust. Grace felt the first inkling of a betrayal that was not yet clear. A man who had known her mother and kept the knowledge like a jewel in a closed box. There was a gap between his confession and the photograph's public mockery, a place where motives smelled faintly of power. Mara's warning echoed. Pastor Joel's silence pressed like a bruise. Dean's nervousness became more pronounced. He began to avoid eye contact, moving like a man who feared spoiling a glass display. In the days that followed, Grace watched the edges of her life shift. Daniel sent small gifts, books on music, a set of practice shoes with soft soles. He offered to fund new mats for the studio to replace the cracked mirrors. He introduced her to Claire, his niece, a woman whose courtesy seemed threaded with curiosity. Claire laughed easily and asked about the children, and Grace felt an unexpected tenderness in the way she listened, as if she were remembering an echo. And yet beneath all the kindness, a question burned hotter than all of it. Why had Daniel made a public game of adoption in front of people who would laugh? Why had he held up her life like a parlor trick? The answer hid behind other answers, in the thin spaces where good intentions and hunger met. Grace sensed that this was not merely about charity. It was about control. She resolved, quietly, to find out more about Eleanor. If Daniel had known her mother, then maybe the cracks in the story would widen into a door. If there was betrayal coming, and she felt at the edge of her skin that there was, then she would rather see it coming and decide how to meet it on her own feet than be swept along like a leaf pulled by someone else's current. Grace did not plan to go into the storeroom. She had gone only to fetch a roll of tape and found the door unlatched, a thin line of dust showing where it had been opened more recently than the rest. The center smelled of old varnish and the small sweetness of lost papers. A single bulb swung over a table where boxes slept like quiet animals. She flipped the light on and the room wrote itself into the air. Stacks of program flyers, donated shoes, a folding chair with peeling paint. Her fingers bumped against something that did not belong to donations, a neat cardboard box tied with string. Her name, in a hand she did not recognize, was on a label. Inside were photographs, a thin packet of letters browned at the edges, and a manila folder stamped with the crest of the Harcourt Foundation. She sank onto a crate and opened the letters with a hand that suddenly shook. They were Eleanor's handwriting, small, slanted, full of the ordinary intimate things mothers write, about a child's cough, about rain, about small proud moments. But there were other notes threaded between them. Receipts from the manor, a cigarette-smoked photograph of Eleanor laughing under a willow, and a letter in a different hand. The other handwriting was careful, even elegant. It read, in part, "Eleanor, do not go into the city. I will sort it out. Trust me. I cannot lose what matters." Grace's chest pulled tight. She read the letters until the edges blurred. There were mentions of meetings at the river, of a promise to fix things, of a name, Daniel, signed with a looped flourish. One letter blurred into a warning. "If you leave with her now, they will find you. Wait until the papers are ready." There was a list, a name crossed out, and underneath it a single line, "Bring Grace to me when you can." The last paper was a photocopy of a document. It looked official enough to make her stomach drop. An agreement for temporary guardianship, dated years earlier with signatures and a witness line. The witness, Dean's name. She stared until the letters slid into each other and the room swayed like a ship. Dean's handwriting. Pastor Joel's initials at the corner of one sheet. She heard feet in the hall and snapped the box shut with clumsy fingers. Dean's hand on the door had once made her think of small favors and mundane kindness. Now it opened, and his face carried the color of someone who had been asked to confess. "Grace," he said, the word like a question he could not hold. "You weren't meant to find that." She held the photograph up without thinking. "What is this?" He folded his hands and looked like a man tired of carrying a thing he had no right to own. "Eleanor trusted us. She trusted me to help when things were dangerous. Why did you sign this? Her voice cut like a wind through thin glass. Why did you allow anyone to claim custody? This says temporary guardianship signed by you. It says Pastor Joel witnessed. What does this mean? Dean swallowed. He had always been awkward with words, but tonight the words came in a rush. Daniel was worried for Eleanor. He had money power. He said he could keep her safe if she let him. She wanted protection for you, better schooling, a safe place, and she thought a contract would be the way. He stopped as if the sentence might fall apart. She begged me. She said she was scared of the men who had been at the manor. She asked me to help her leave quietly. Daniel offered to place you. He said it would be temporary until things settled. Temporary, Grace echoed, feeling the small syllable turn into a stone. And then, Dean's mouth worked. He had the look of a man who had once loved his own ideas more than their real cost. Then there were complications. Daniel, he did not keep to the terms the way Eleanor believed. He had lawyers. There were records that went missing. Pastor Joel, he tried to help, but he was out of his depth. He thought by witnessing he could give her leverage. She trusted us, and he could not finish. Grace pictured the terrace, the chandelier, the way Daniel had watched her as if measuring for suit. She had believed his polite words might hide regret. Now the letters said otherwise. Daniel's neat script promising aid. His neat power erasing the person who trusted him. Her body felt hollowed. You mean he took her, Grace said, the thought forming like a cracked bell. He took her away from me. Dean flinched. I helped. I thought I was protecting you both. I believed if I signed, he would put you in a safe place. He promised me. I was a fool. Anger rose like bile. You signed away my life, she said. You signed away my mother. No. Dean pressed his palms to his knees. You don't understand fully. There were threats. Men from the manor, men who worked for contractors, arrived one night. They said Eleanor had to leave the city. Daniel, he convinced her it was for safety. He offered to keep you safe under his wing. I thought, his voice broke, I thought I was saving you from something worse. Grace's hands went cold. She looked at the photocopy of the temporary guardianship and then at the letters where Eleanor had written, Bring Grace to me when you can. The promise and the erasure lay side by side like two faces of the same coin. The betrayal was a map with Daniel's name inked all over it. You knew, she said then, the word small and like a missile. You knew he had means to what? To disappear from her? To keep her from coming back? Dean lowered his eyes. He had influence. He had money. I saw contracts come through his office, settlements, transfers. There were payments into accounts with names I did not know. I told Pastor Joel I was uncomfortable. Joel, he argued. He said, we had to trust that Daniel had good reasons. He thought Daniel's reputation would protect us. Grace felt as if someone had cut a channel through the world and poured a new stream into it, one made of lost trust and cold, clinical betrayal. Pastor Joel had been a cushion for her faith, someone she had leaned on in prayer. Dean had been a helper with cornered kindness. Now both had been folded into the same paper, Daniel's paper. She stood, and the box slid from her hands to the floor. She listened for the small sounds, her heartbeat, Dean's breathing, the bulb swinging above them, and felt the radius of everything she had trusted collapse inward. Why did he do it? She whispered. Why make a game of me at the manor if he already had power over my life? Dean looked away. His face flinched, as if at the memory of applause. He wanted to see what you had become. He wanted proof. People like him collect proof of bloodlines, of talent, of things to display. When you danced, he was not offering. He was collecting. The word landed heavy and ugly. Collected. Grace pictured herself reduced to an object on a shelf, measured and labeled for a man's curiosity. The letters in her hands were suddenly a ransom note written in polite ink. He used us, she said. You let him use us. I let myself believe in a good end, Dean said quietly. I am sorry, Grace. I am sorry. The apology had no power to unmake the missing years. She thought of Eleanor's handwriting, the way it warned, the way it begged, the way it trusted. She thought of the woman's laugh under the willow, of a promise that had been traded for a neat signature and a ledger. Against the stupor of betrayal, something harder grew, a fierce, clean resolve. If Daniel had kept secrets and bought silence, if he had turned care into control, then Grace would not let the story end with him as judge. "I will find her," she said. The words were small, but steady now. "I will find Eleanor, and I will make them not keep her hidden." Dean flinched, like someone struck, but he did not deny her. Around them, the community center seemed to hold its breath, the bulb above blinking like an eye in an old face. Outside, the city moved on, unaware that in its belly a betrayal had been named and a path had been set. She folded the letters carefully and placed them back in the box. Then she reached for the photograph one last time and tucked it into the pocket nearest her heart. The betrayal had come from inside her circle, it cut deep and clean. But it also gave her, in its ugly honesty, the place to start looking. The days that followed felt like walking through a city that had rearranged itself without warning. Every familiar corner held a new question. Grace moved through them with a kind of careful fury, small, precise acts that felt like carving a path through fog. She whispered plans to no one, wrote lists on the backs of program flyers, and kept Eleanor's photograph folded in the pocket of her coat like a talisman. The photograph warmed against her skin and made her feel less alone in the cold. Daniel answered her anger with a smooth patience that made it worse. He sent letters that smelled faintly of his study, leather and old paper, and each one read like an offer polished until it gleamed. He offered legal aid, scholarships, community grants. He offered Claire's company at the center when she visited with baskets of fruit. He never apologized for the signatures or the missing years. Instead, he phrased his control as care, as if ownership could wear the face of kindness. "Grace," he said once in a public meeting where a charity representative introduced him as a patron, "I only ever wanted what was best. Sometimes the hands that remove danger do so clumsily. I regret that your mother's departure caused pain." The room nodded politely. Pastor Joel gave a small, mechanical smile that did not reach his eyes. Dean's face looked like a map with every route marked in regret. Around them, the community felt split between gratitude for Daniel's largesse and the faint taste of shame that sometimes accompanies being given help by a man who kept ledgers of people. Outside the manor's polite light, the city tightened pressure in other ways. The landlord of the community center, an old man who had tolerated years of late rent because the center fed children and kept the neighborhood from fraying, received a letter from a law firm representing an anonymous investor who claimed rights to renovate the building. The letter smelled of oil and new signatures. It cited zoning violations and safety hazards and ended with a note, "We would be willing to discuss terms for temporary relocation." The words were a polite hammer. Grace held the notice in her hands as if it might be warm enough to burn. The children's footsteps echoed in her memory. Little shoes lined outside the studio door like small, hopeful soldiers. If the center closed, where would they go? Who would gather their small, awkward courage and teach them to step into music? Her fear for them sharpened into something like rage. This was not just about her mother or about the photograph. This was about the safety net that Daniel's money could tear away while he smiled in charity. She went to the landlord and argued, voice shaking. He patted her hand with tired sympathy and said there were legal processes that might buy time. Dean fought behind the scenes, calling lawyers he had met through minor favors. His guilt had turned into restless protectiveness. But the law moved like an old animal, slow, expensive, and hungry. Then the threats began. Anonymous notes slipped under the center's door, typed, polite, precise. "Cease interference," one read. Another, more blunt, "Stay out of certain affairs." The paper felt like a cold finger tracing the spine of the city. At night, Grace found a smear of tar on the studio door, a deliberate, childish cruelty that smelled of soot and someone else's leisure. The children cried the next morning when they touched the sticky black and watched their teacher scrub until her hands stung. "You should take Daniel up on his offer. Mara said once, blunt and frightened. If he's so powerful, his money could fight this. Why be proud when the roof is leaking over 5-year-olds? Grace wanted to answer with the stubborn honesty that had been her compass, but the choice lay jagged in front of her. Accept Daniel's help and risk being part of the same ledger that hid her mother, refuse and risk losing everything they had built. The moral dilemma bruised her like a repeated slap. She found herself waking with Daniel's neat handwriting in her mouth, tasting both the danger and the potential lifeline. Pastor Joel hovered on the edge of counsel and avoidance. In private, he said, "We must pray and seek wisdom." In public, he smiled and thanked patrons. Once, when no one else could see, he took Grace's hands and said, "I believed people could be better." His eyes were wet, as if repentance and relief had the same color. "I should have done more." "You signed," Grace said quietly. The accusation was not for him alone. It was a demand that the church, the ledger, and complicity face the light. Joel flinched. "I was young and thought I could meditate. I thought bearing witness would create a record, proof we could use. I did not expect to be influenced by eating proof. I thought faith and records would be anchors. I was wrong." Guilt became a shared weight, and Dean retreated into himself. He stopped bringing bread to the center and avoided Grace's gaze. She saw him once leaving a meeting with a man she recognized from the manor's contractors, broad shoulders and an easy sympathy. The sight felt like a new bruise. The community fractured in quieter ways. Parents whispered at pickup times, some avoided the center at evening classes, afraid of being pulled into a dispute they did not understand. The children felt it too. The adults' hushed tones leaked into their world like cold drafts. Grace watched them practice small steps, their faces puckered in concentration, and felt the pressure compress into one white-hot point. She could not let these children lose their safe place because she chose not to bargain with the man who had hidden her mother. She began to spy in small, practical ways. She checked public records at the courthouse and sat for hours in the municipal office, tracing property transfers and odd donations. The language of contracts began to make a dreadful sort of sense. She read with the fever of someone learning the rules of a game they had been playing in. She hired with money she scraped from teaching extra lessons and from a small crowdfunding page Claire had quietly started, a young paralegal named Simon who owed her a favor from his youth days at the center. Simon found a trail of payments funneled through shell accounts, receipts that led to accounts with names that matched the signatures in Eleanor's letters. When Grace confronted Dean with the new paper, a ledger that tied legal fees to Daniel's foundation, he sank into a plastic chair and wept like a man whose hands had been cut away. "I was naive," he repeated. "I told myself we would be safe. I told myself if I made the choice then, it would keep you safe later. I was wrong." The weeping did not absolve him. It also did not stop the men who came once at dusk and stood across the street watching the center. They did not step forward. They only watched, their jackets like barricades. Grace felt the city growing smaller, hemmed in by eyes that valued her life as a curiosity and not a person. Pressure can bend people into surprising shapes. Claire's visits grew more frequent and less easy. Sometimes she stayed late helping sweep, and her laughter sounded forced. Once, when Grace pressed her about Daniel's involvement, Claire's hand trembled, and she said, "People change, Grace. Daniel isn't all one thing." "Is he?" Grace asked, and the question hung like a knife. That night, a new note arrived, not on paper, but on a phone buzzing with an unknown number. The message was short: "Stop asking. It will be Kinder." Attached was a photograph of the center's playground at night. Someone had stood close enough to capture an empty swing and the shadow of the building like a black mouth. Grace sat on the floor among scattered program flyers and felt the narrowness of choice press against her. There was fear, sharp animal fear, and there was resolve, a different animal, steadier and hard. She could pay the price Daniel asked in quiet ways. Silence, adoption, becoming another item in his well-curated collection. Or she could keep fighting and risk the children, the center, and whatever remained of her fragile safety. She thought of Eleanor's last letter, Bring Grace to me when you can, and of Dean's signature on a paper that had been meant to protect. The choice narrowed into two paths. One that might free resources to find Eleanor fast, but trade Grace's agency for comfort. The other an uncertain, dangerous path that might cost everything but keep her hands unclean. Her decision flared like a beacon. She would not sell herself to the ledger. She would not let Daniel own the narrative of her life. Even if it meant losing the center, she would rather walk into the cold and search than stand under someone's light that made her a trophy. The thought steadied her. It also quietly made enemies. The night the truth broke open, the manor wore rain like a fine cloak. Water ran in shining lines down the stone steps, turning each footfall into a small drumbeat. Grace moved through the servants' door with Simon at her shoulder and Claire, unexpected and trembling, at her back. The manor's grand lights threw long, honest shadows that cut the gravel into stark maps. Inside, the music halls were full of polite laughter and lacquered voices. The house held its breath as if waiting for a quarrel to be polite. They did not go to the terrace where Daniel liked to show his charity. They went lower, past rooms that smelled of lemon polish and old accords, into wings the guests never saw. Claire guided them with hands that shook like leaves. "This way," she whispered, and every word sounded like a choice she had made. At the end of a corridor lay a door with a brass plaque rubbed nearly blank. Claire touched it as if the contact might burn her. "They moved her after the papers," she said. "They said it was best." Her voice stopped. She wrapped her arms around herself as if she could hold courage into being. The latch was old, but it gave. The room beyond was small and trimmed with a kind of poverty that had once been dignity. A single cot, a small table with a cup of tea gone cold, a window that looked onto a courtyard no one walked, and on the bed, propped by pillows, sat a woman whose bones had grown words into the paper of her face. Eleanor. For a breath, pure and fragile, Grace might have thought the light in the room was a trick. Eleanor's hair had gone silver in long, slow waves. Her hands held a photograph with trembling certainty. When she looked up, her eyes found Grace, and something like a moth of recognition fluttered and caught fire. "My girl," Eleanor said, and the voice carried the river of years all at once. Grace's knees went weak. She stepped forward, and the world shrank to the sound of her shoes on the old rug. "Mama," she said, the single syllable a thing that broke and mended in the same moment. Eleanor rose with a slow miracle, and they held each other like two halves of a map that suddenly matched. The door banged open, and Daniel came in as if the room were a stage he had scripted. He moved with that same careful calm they had all learned fear. "Grace," he said, soft as linen, "I see we have been honest with one another at last." Grace pulled back, hands on Eleanor's shoulders, heart roaring. "Why?" The question was about a blade. Why did you hide her? Why sign papers like thieves and pretend you were protecting her? He smiled, the curve of it precise and practiced. "Protection is never neat, Miss Grace. There were risks, people who would have taken her for reasons I will not repeat. I secured her safety. I made decisions to prevent harm." Eleanor's face had the hard lines of someone who had been kept too small for too long. "I trusted you," she said. "I trusted you, and you put me in a room like a thing to be polished. I wrote to you. I said, 'Do not move her without telling me.' You wrote back, 'It is for the best.' You put a contract in Dean's hands like it was a shield. It was a trap." Dean had followed them. He stood in the doorway with the same shame written in his posture that had haunted him these months. Pastor Joel had been there too, his collar like a pale confession. Dean's knees gave, and he sank to the floor as if the weight of his choices had become a physical thing he could not carry. "I thought I was saving you both," he stammered. "I thought he promised to care. He promised safety. I signed because I believed we could hide you from danger." Eleanor's laugh was brittle. "You hid me from one danger and into another hand." Daniel's hands were folded, an image of composure. "You forget context, Miss Grace. I did not act for cruelty. I acted to keep a woman from the wrong people. The records, my lawyers, needed to make things clean. You were young. I thought we were arranging a future. Arranging a future, Grace echoed, feeling the syllables tally like receipts. You arranged her like an account. You told yourself later you had done the right thing, and you paraded my life so you could collect the proof. Claire's face had been pale, and now it hardened. I heard recordings, she said. I found them when I was cleaning his office. He thought I would bury them. He thought family calls for loyalty, not truth. She stepped forward, hand in her bag, and Simon took from her a small device. You wanted proof, Claire said, and press play. Daniel's face changed in the thin space of a single breath. The speakers carried the clean, damning cut of his own voice, discussing transfers, discussing how Eleanor's disappearance would be smoother if framed as relocation, explaining how Grace could be made to fit certain circles if placed properly. The words were clinical, the laughter afterward like a seal on a doomed letter. The Manor's polite laughter was a distant thing. In the small room, the recordings were a simple, final witness. Daniel's mouth thinned. For the first time, he lost measure. That recording is taken out of context. Context. Grace's voice was flat as iron. You took a life out of context and boxed it up. You made a child into a charity act. You made my mother into something you could polish. Eleanor's hand found Grace's and held it with a strength that belied her years. They told me it would keep you safe, she said to Grace. I was frightened. I was foolish. But I thought if you were somewhere warm, someone would watch you. How could you? Grace breathed, half to Eleanor, half to the room. How could you let them decide? Pastor Joel knelt, old robes folding. I should have been louder, he said, the words a raw, honest thing. I told myself I would meditate. I thought my signature would create a record of concern. I did not think influence would swallow the truth. Outside, footsteps rounded the corridor, staff and guests drawn by a sound they could not name. In the hall, the world felt suddenly small and clever men fragile. A security guard appeared in the doorway and froze when he saw the scene. He had been given orders before. Now, he had the sight of human ruin in front of him, and it made his jaw slack. Daniel reached for measured calm and found it slipping. You betray me, he said slowly, as if mapping an injury. Claire, how could you? Claire's face was pale, but steady. I am not his trophy. I am not his silence. She looked at him with that new hardness. I will not keep hurting to protect your image. Simon had more than recordings. He had papers, ledgers, transfer slips, the receipts that traced money the way a river traces a coastline. He set them on the table like a slow, relentless tide. We traced accounts, he said. You paid contractors, you paid off records. You built a quiet house for a woman you were supposed to protect. Daniel's expression made him old and small at once. You'll ruin lives, he warned, but the warning sounded like a final, tired argument. He had counted on discretion as currency. Now the currency was evidence. Grace's anger was a bright, unladled thing. She thought of the children, of the tar on the playground door, of nights she had held small hands and promised to teach them to dance. She thought of a woman who had left letters and warnings and had been silenced by a man who wore generosity like armor. You took my name and made it a spectacle, she said. You thought you could decide who I belonged to. You were wrong. Daniel looked at Eleanor then, at the lines on her face, the stubborn set of her jaw. For a moment, something like regret flickered. I thought I could keep you safe, he said, softer now, but the words ran thin. I failed in the way of men who believe they can buy safety. Grace's legs felt like they might give. The room had rearranged itself into a place where truth could not be put back into a neat box. The recordings and ledgers spoke for themselves. The villagers in the corridor waited, their faces a strange mixture of judgment and pity. Outside, guests murmured and a faint hubbub rose. The manor could not swallow the sound. Dean, pale and small, raised his head and met Grace's eyes. She saw in him a confession that was as human as sin. I am sorry, he whispered. I am sorry. Eleanor squeezed Grace's hand and smiled, a terrible, beautiful thing. We have our story back, she said. Not all endings are neat, but we can speak ours, and it matters. Daniel took a step back. His empire of suits and smile trembled like a curtain at a wind. He opened his mouth to call for lawyers, for protection, for the neat machinery of power to wheel into place, but the sound that answered him was different. The security guard walked past him to the door and, with the quiet of someone who had seen too much, closed it behind him. Outside, rain washed away the footprints in the gravel. Inside, truth sat on the table like an honest thing and waited to be spoken. Rain had stopped for good by the time the city began to breathe again. The clouds had pulled back and left a thin, honest light that showed everything as it was, no softening, no flattering shadow. The center smelled of lemon and wet wood. Volunteers scrubbed tables and rewired the old light fixtures. Children returned in ones and twos, eyes wide as if they'd been waiting for permission to hope again. Grace stood at the door and watched them come, a quiet tremor in her chest that felt like a bruise turning into something softer. After the manor, nothing moved the same. News of the recordings and the ledgers spread faster than any single person could have hoped. Journalists asked questions, lawyers filed papers, and the Harcourt Foundation faced audits that unpinned the neatness of its public face. Daniel retreated into a shell of statements and hired counsel. The men who had watched the center from across the street stopped coming and looked smaller when they walked by. Dean cooperated in the investigations in a way that looked like penance. He named his errors and showed the papers he had signed with trembling hands. Pastor Joel offered public apologies that his prayers had not prepared to say. In private, he sat with Grace and Eleanor and let them speak until their voices smoothed into something that held less jaggedness. But the law did not fix everything. Money changed hands, reputations shifted, and buildings kept their cold bones even when windows were mended. The center's landlord rescinded the renovation threats once public pressure mounted, and a small fund organized by Claire and Simon covered overdue rent for another year. It was not Daniel's money that saved them in the end. It was the city, people who chose to be seen and chosen in return. That was a lesson Grace kept returning to like a small, steady prayer. Eleanor had to learn how to be free in a new way. She left the room at the manor with careful steps. For years, she had been contained by the idea of safety. Now, safety meant making decisions for herself. Grace watched her mother learn small, ordinary things again. How to iron a shirt, how to choose a bus route, how to carry 2 shopping bags without spilling pride. They ate boiled potatoes and laughed over burnt toast. Sometimes Eleanor cried, not from pain but from the sudden lightness of being allowed to be ordinary. Other times she merely sat quiet, a thread pulled back through time, and Grace learned to hold that silence with a gentleness she had not known she owned. Confronting Daniel had not been a clean victory. He had resources and lawyers, and a network of people who liked their lives tied to his. He offered settlements, money with conditions, quiet non-disclosures, offers to fund new wings of the very center he had once threatened. Grace refused. The thought of taking his money in exchange for silence felt like stepping back into the ledger she had torn. She wanted the center to be saved by hands that did not mark the debt in ink. She wanted truth to matter more than convenience. The decision cost them. Some donors pulled back, afraid of public complication. They patched things with grassroots drives and small benefits. They learned how to bake cakes and belt out old hymns at community halls. Claire organized evenings where people paid small sums for soup and music. Simon ran a legal aid table once a week to teach others how to read contracts. People who had once been content to watch life like a spectator began to sew the life of the place together. Grace watched teachers come back, one by one, and the children's laughter returned like a slow tide. Her anger toward those who had failed her softened, but it did not vanish. Forgiveness, she discovered, was not a single act, but a long, patient weathering. She forgave Dean because he had shown his shame in the only way he could, by telling the truth and by stepping aside when needed. She forgave Pastor Joel for thinking records and prayer would be anchors. His public contrition and quiet work with the parents proved he was learning the difference between faith as a cushion and faith as action. Claire became a friend who admitted mistakes and chose to act differently. Simon stayed because small debts of gratitude had grown into real loyalty. They were human, and so were their faults. Grace found that the hardest person to reckon with was herself. For weeks, she carried a hollow ache where anger and relief and guilt tangled. She had wanted her mother found, and she had wanted justice. When they came together, part of her felt triumphant, and another part felt stripped raw. She thought about the time she had stood under a light and felt exposed, how easy it had been to be admired, and how much easier for others to use admiration as a way to own. She thought about power, about how often the language of help can hide a ledger, and about the temptation to answer control with control. One evening, after the children had left and the studio breathed in quiet, Grace sat alone and looked at the photograph she had carried for months. Eleanor had drawn lines on the back, children's names, a joke about a cat, a tiny heart. Grace traced the letter E with one finger and felt the years fold. She thought of Daniel standing in that small room, of his careful hands, and wondered whether making him small had helped her be larger. Retribution could bring justice, she knew, but it could also hollow a person into the very shape they had used to hurt others. She chose a different kind of ending. At a meeting with the community, she proposed a new rule for the center. No single benefactor could have controlling power. Decisions must be collective, transparent, and accountable. People voted, some reluctantly and some with quiet relief. They set up a small board that rotated membership and required any donations above a modest sum to be matched by fundraising. It was not elegant or efficient, it was honest. In the weeks that followed, she taught children again. She watched a little boy trip and then stood up and tried again, the way Grace had learned to do, with a life that had been given and given back. She taught them to hold the music in their ribs, to let it carry their truth when words failed. Sometimes Eleanor sat in the back with a shawl and watched, and Grace would catch her eye, and they would both smile, small, private things that carried whole conversations. One night, as the city prepared for a new season, Grace walked the river where she had once imagined silk dresses and polished shoes. The water moved steady and sure, unconcerned with human ledger or cruelty. She thought of Daniel, how power can be mistaken for care, and of the many small ways people shore each other up. She thought of the moral lines that had been crossed and the lines they had drawn to repair them. She did not pretend everything was solved. Some nights she woke with the old ache, and sometimes the sight of a chandelier sent a small flare of unease into her chest. But the fear had a different edge now. It was tempered by choice. If she had been offered adoption again, she would refuse. Not out of spite, but because she had learned that belonging could not mean being owned. She wanted a life where she and her mother and the children at the center could make choices together, messy and brave. She wanted a story that did not end with someone else deciding what it meant to be saved. When the center bell chimed for the evening class, Grace took Eleanor's hand and led her inside. The music began, awkward and sweet, and children found their steps. Grace watched them move and felt, in the marrow of her bones, a tenderness that had grown from pain into a steady root. She had not been adopted by a wealthy man, nor had she sold herself to safety. Instead, she had found a community that refused to be small, and a family rebuilt in the open air. In the quiet that followed the last note, she whispered a prayer, not for rescue but for courage. It was a prayer less about being saved and more about the work of saving one another day by day. The city hummed beyond the windows, and for the first time in a long while, Grace let herself believe that living honestly was a kind of victory that money could never buy. If you found this story powerful, make sure to hit that like button, share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more videos like this. Your support helps us bring more important stories to light.